Last time I showed you Flask, a Python web framework, and we saw that we can use Flask to automate repetitive tasks. And essentially, we can use Flask to generate web pages dynamically using Python code instead of having static HTML pages that use JavaScript to fetch information from a server or do something complicated like that. But it turns out that the power of Flask really lies in another library that's bundled with it. And that library is called Jinja. Jinja is a web templating framework. And today, we're going to talk about how to unleash the power of Flask using Jinja. So last time we talked about frameworks. And we said that frameworks have a lot of advantages over raw CGI scripts. For one thing, we can automate things like producing HTTP headers. So we saw that if we use Flask, we can map different URLs to different functions in our code. And those functions can just print HTML, and they don't have to worry about HTTP headers. They can fetch data from a form easily, and we don't have to do all the work that we had to do with CGI. So this is a really nice system. It's very easy to use. It saves us a lot of time. But the biggest advantage of these frameworks is that they provide something called web templating. And all web templating is the ability to write a web page and embed dynamic code directly into the web page. By dynamic code, in this case, I mean Python, something that runs on the server. And the idea is we're going to write a template file that has HTML code and some embedded template code. And Flask is going to take that file and look up some information from a database or from a file. And then it's going to transform our template into an actual HTML page that it can send to the browser that the browser can render. So for example, if I have a website that wants to display some weather information, I can generate a template that has all the HTML code, but instead of actually giving a temperature and some humidity and precipitation amounts and wind speed, I can fetch that data from the server and embed it into my template. And that way, if the weather changes, we'll automatically have new information when we load the page. So the templating library that comes with Flask is called Jinja, J-I-N-J-A. And to use it, we have to create a special folder named templates. And we're going to put our template files in the templates folder. And that folder goes inside our project folder. So we're going to have our Flask code in one folder. And inside the folder that has our Flask code, we're going to have a subdirectory, a subfolder that contains our Jinja templates. And we're going to create files in the templates folder. And they're just .html files. But we're going to embed some special code into the HTML. So here's a really simple example. I mentioned using this for weather. So this looks like an HTML page. We've got our doc type tag at the top. We've got our HTML tag that sets the language to English. We've got head and title. We've got body. And I've also got an unordered list, a UL tag. And inside, I have several list items, LI tags. But notice that inside each LI tag, I have something a little strange. I have two curly braces, the word tempf, and then two closing curly braces. And then after chance of precipitation, I have curly brace, precip, curly brace. And similarly, after humidity, I have another variable embedded in curly braces. What's going on with this? Well, that's a Jinja template. And I can take that Jinja template, and I can map it to a URL using Flask. How do I do that? Well, I use app.root to map a Python function to the slash URL, the default URL that someone will get if they go to my server. And I'm going to call that function main. And I'm going to use some function to get weather information, weather data. So I called it getWeather. Maybe getWeather goes out to a database and does some kind of query to pull in some weather information. Or maybe getWeather reads a file to get some weather information. Or maybe it contacts a website and does some REST queries, which that's more advanced than we're really going to talk about in this class. But it's going to obtain this weather information. And then, instead of returning a string like we normally do, it's going to call a special function called renderTemplate. And renderTemplate is going to take the weather.html template that we just wrote, this one here, and it's going to provide it with some variables. It's going to set tempf to be the temperature in that weather data. It's going to set precip to be the precip data in that weather variable. And it's going to set humidity to be the humidity information from that weather object. And what's going to happen is that it's going to display a web page that looks like this. It's going to say temperature 45, chance of precipitation 10, humidity 45. What's happening is that Flask is taking this HTML and it's replacing everything between curly braces, the double curly braces, with a variable, a Python variable that it obtains here. So everywhere here that it sees curly brace, tempf, curly brace, it replaces that entire string, including the curly braces, with the value that it fetched using get weather. So if the temperature was 45 degrees Fahrenheit, it would replace it with 45. That's what's happening here. So this is really useful. Here's a little bit more detail on that. So we can do simple variable replacement. If I take the name of a variable and I put it in double curly braces, then Jinja is going to look for that variable in the parameters that we pass to the render template function, and it's going to fill in the placeholder with that value. The placeholder is the thing in curly braces. So it's going to take the value we tell it the temperature is and put it in where we said curly brace temp. It turns out that Jinja actually provides a lot of fancy features that go along with this. And one of the things that we can do is called escaping. So if you fetch data from a file, for example, that data might contain HTML tags. And if it does, you may want to just display it normally. In other words, you might want to embed the HTML into your page. For example, if you wanted to bold something, you might want to do that. But often it's a bad idea to embed HTML tags into our template. The reason for that is that there's a hacking attack called cross-site scripting that we have to be careful about. Cross-site scripting means that someone embeds a link in our page or some JavaScript code in our page that causes malicious behavior. So it might be a phishing link. It might be a link to some scam website. So when someone clicks on it, they're giving up their login information or some other personal information. Or they're going to go to a web page that has some sort of scam. It might be some embedded JavaScript code that runs something in their browser that infects their system with malware. So we don't want to allow user input to become HTML code in a template. So typically what you want to do is you want to escape your HTML code. So instead of actually embedding it as HTML, it uses HTML entities to encode it so they can see the actual tags in the page. So if you want to do that, there's a really easy way to do it in Jinja. All you do is inside your curly braces, you put a pipe and then the word escape. And that'll automatically escape the variable. So it'll take variable name, whatever it is, and it'll search it for bad characters, angle brackets, ampersands, anything that might be HTML code, and it'll replace it with HTML entities that represent it. That was a really long-winded explanation. I guess what I'm saying is that typically when you use a Jinja variable, you want to put pipe escape after it. By the way, pipe is the vertical bar character. You can get it by typing shift / on your keyboard. Because we use this so often, Jinja has what's called an alias. You can actually type just pipe E instead of typing out the whole word escape. You can just put the E, and that will also work. So this is called using a filter. So pipe escape is one kind of filter. It takes the variable, and before putting it in the website, before embedding it in the template, it performs an operation on it that makes it safe. Well, we can perform other operations other than just escaping, and here are some of the ones that Jinja provides. One is the capitalize filter. So if I put some value into Jinja, and then I say pipe capitalize, Jinja will make sure that all of the letters are lowercase except the first one, and it'll make that uppercase. This is useful for like proper names. So if I have a username or a first name and a last name, and I want to display them, I probably want to pipe capitalize after my variable name so that they'll display properly. So for example, if I do curly brace, brown bear, notice I have double quotes, so this is a string literal, and I pipe it through capitalize, it'll replace that whole expression with just brown bear with a capital B. And notice that I used to have a capital B in the middle of the word. That becomes a lowercase letter. Similarly, I can use the lower filter to convert all the letters to lowercase. And I can use the upper filter to convert all the letters to uppercase. Another filter that Jinja provides is the default filter. Sometimes we want to look up some value, and that information is not available. Maybe I'm trying to fetch weather data, and I get the temperature and the wind speed, but the humidity information isn't available. So the way that that's handled typically in Python is that we get an undefined value. It's set to a special keyword none. And what's kind of cool about Jinja is it provides this default pipe that will check if that's the case. And if the variable isn't defined, we can replace it with a default value. So for example here, I can say curly brace name pipe default of user. Notice that some filters can take parameters and it just looks like a function call in Python. So what will happen here is if the name is defined, if the user typed in a name into the form, for example, it'll use the name they typed in. But if they didn't provide a name, the name will be undefined, and instead of just printing nothing, we can provide the default user. So it'll embed user, the string user, into the web page. Jinja also provides you with the ability to have loops in your website. So for example, if you want to repeat things a bunch of times, you can use a loop in Jinja to duplicate the HTML code several times. So for example, suppose I have a list of winners, people who've, I don't know, won the lottery. Instead of having the same li tag and b tag with each winner, I can just use a Jinja for loop. So I can say curly brace %, and then the syntax is the word for, a variable name, and you can pick anything you want here. I've chosen the word name. And then the keyword in, and then a Python list named winners. We're going to have to pass winners into the render template function. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. And then we close the curly brace with %curly brace. Then I embed my HTML code, and now name is a variable. So I can use curly brace name, curly brace, and Jinja's going to replace that placeholder with the name of each winner. So it's going to create not 1 or 2, but say 5 winners. If I have 5 winners, it's going to create 5 list items and 5 bold tags, 1 for each person in the winners list. And I tell it that I'm done with my loop with the end for keyword. So if you have a for command and an end for, everything between that will be duplicated for each winner in the list. So if I do it like this, it'll actually list the winners in the original order, whatever order they're in the Python list. But Jinja also provides a filter that allows me to reverse the order. So if I just add pipe reverse after the winners list, it'll actually reverse the order and print them backwards. That can be useful. OK. In addition to using lists and tuples, we can actually use Python dictionaries. So again, our template looks like HTML. We have our doc type tag, we have our HTML tag, our head and title tag, we have our body. I'm going to use a dictionary list this time. I don't know if you remember dictionary lists, but they start with a DL tag and end with a /DL. And instead of just having one list item element, they have 2. They have a dictionary term and a dictionary definition. So I'm going to loop through all the names in my scores dictionary. And I just say scores.keys to get a list of all of the names in the dictionary. And then I can use the name itself as my dictionary term. And in my dictionary definition, I'm going to say the word score, colon. And then I'm going to go look up the scores in the dictionary. So I just use the same square bracket notation here that I would use in Python. I'm going to say go to the scores mapping and look up this particular person, the person with name. So for example, maybe my scores, I've got Robert has 30 points and Ben has 10. Well, then the first time I go through this list, it's going to look at all the keys. So it's going to look at Robert and Ben, and the name will be Robert, and then it'll be Ben. So it's going to print out a DT tag, and then Robert, and then a /DT tag. And then it's going to print out a DD tag, the word score, and then it'll look up Robert's score in the scores table and say 30. And it'll put score colon 30, and then /DD. And then it'll do the same thing with Ben. It'll put Ben in for the name, and then it'll look up Ben's score and say score colon, and then the 10 that is Ben's score. So let's look at how I can use these in Flask. So again, from Flask, I have to import Flask, but I also import rendered template. I should have mentioned that before. And then in my root, for /, I have my main function. And I'm just hard coding a dictionary here. So I've created a dictionary named winners. And it's mapping Joseph to 20 points, Nigel has 15 points, Ursula has 30 points, and Bernice has 7 points. Poor Bernice. Unless this is golf, in which case Bernice is winning. And then I use my render template function. I return render template. And I have to tell it the name of the template, which is scores.html. That's the name of this file here. And then I set scores equal to my winners dictionary. So it's going to take this mapping that says Joseph has 20, Nigel has 15, Ursula has 30 points, and Bernice has 7. And that's going to be named scores in my template. So when it renders this template, everywhere it sees scores, the keys are going to be Joseph, Nigel, Ursula, and Bernice. And it's going to map Joseph to 20, Nigel to 15, Ursula to 30, and so forth. So that looks like this. Okay. If I actually view source, you would see the D tag and the DL tag and the DD tags around Ursula and score 30 and so forth. Notice I didn't have to write the DD tags and the name and the score colon a bunch of times. I only had to do it once inside a for loop, and then Jinja repeats it for me, which is nice. So I can have loops. I can also have conditions. Just like we can have if statements in Python, we can use if statements in Jinja. So here is, in blue, a Jinja template, which I've named condition.html. And it starts with a doc type tag and an HTML tag and lots of HTML that you're familiar with. But then I have a curly brace and a percent, and then the keyword if, and then the variable name user. So if user, and then I say is equal to, and equal to is actually a function that's provided by Jinja. So it knows how to compare two strings by using is equal to. And in single quotes, I've put the string Bob. So if user is equal to Bob, and I've got my percent curly brace to end the Jinja code, I'm going to embed this HTML. Remember, I can have just plain text, and that's considered HTML, right? It's an entity. So welcome master. And then I have an else command in Jinja command syntax. And in the else section, I have hello peon, and then I have an endif command. So I can render that from Flask. My Flask code looks like this. From Flask import Flask, render template. I create a server named app. I route the /username route to app. So if you go to server/Bob, the username will be Bob. If you go to server/George, the username will be George. And we're passing the username to the main function. That's why I have def main and in parentheses the username. So whatever they type in after the slash, that's going to become the username. So then we can return, and we use render template to render the condition.html file. That's the blue stuff. And we set the variable user to the username. That's the username they typed after the slash. OK, so there's a bunch of conditions that you can use. I showed you equal to already. That tests if two objects or strings are the same. There's also a defined condition that checks whether an object has been passed to the template or not. So we could check to see if there is a username, right? If they just said slash with no username, then username wouldn't be defined. So we can say if is defined. If user is defined, do this, else do that. We can also use undefined, which is the opposite. If we have a number, we can check if it's divisible by 3 or divisible by 7, or if it's even or if it's odd. And there are about 30 other different conditions that we can use, but these are some of the most important ones. So all of this is really handy, especially loops. But another really great feature of Jinja is that it allows us to do what's called template inheritance. Essentially what that means is that if I write a base template, I can use that base template over and over to make other templates, and I don't have to duplicate everything I've already done. So for example, suppose I create a template named base.html that has this code. It's got my doc type tag, it's got my HTML tag, it's got my head and title. And we'll come back to the title because I've got this block thing I'm going to talk about in a minute. I've got my body tag, and I've got a paragraph inside the body that contains another block. Then I've got my /body tag and my /HTML tag. What I can do is I can then create another template named about.html. And at the top of that template, I can say extends base.html. And what Jinja is going to do is it's going to basically copy and paste everything from base.html into about.html for me. But it'll let me override some parts of it. So that's what the blocks are for. Notice that in base.html, I have this keyword that says curly brace percent block title percent curly brace. And then I have the word title there. And then I have an end block constructor. And later in the document, I have block content and end block. What this is doing is it's allowing me to replace part of the base template. If I create a block named title in about HTML, Anything I put between block title and end block will replace what I have between block title and end block in base.html. So if you look at about.html, you'll see I have block title and I have the word about and then an end block. What's going to happen is that in the title, in base.html, instead of the word title, I'm going to replace that with the word about. So in about.html, the title will be about, but in base.html, it's title. In base.html, I have a content block that has the text example content. But in about.html, I'm going to override that by having a new content block that says this is an about page. So I can render that in Flask. I'm going to have, this time, two different roots. I'm going to have app.root/, which is going to render the base template. And I'm going to have app.route/about, which is going to render the about template. And so if I render the base template, if I go to http://myserver/ and hit enter, I'm going to get what you see over here on the right. I'm going to get a window that says example content, and the title is title. If you view source, you'll see what's on the left side of the slide. This is the actual source. Notice I've got my doc type HTML, I've got my HTML lang equals en, I've got my head and title tags, and I've got the word title. That's what I put there in base.html. Notice that in my body, I have paragraph tags that contain the words example content. If I now go to /about, http://myservername/about, and hit enter, I get a different web page. But notice, it has the doc type HTML tag, it has the HTML lang gets en tag, it has the head and the title, but now my title isn't title anymore, it's about. And in my paragraph inside the body, instead of example content, I have this is an about page. So this is really handy. I can have one page that has my doc type and my head tag and all that stuff that I have in every web page. And instead of typing it over and over and over into different files, I can just have it in one file. And I can reuse it in all my other web pages and only change the things that are different. And I can do that using blocks. One of the great things about this, by the way, is that if I decide I need to make a change, like I want to use a different style sheet, well, I can change it in one file, and it'll change for the entire website. I don't have to do like a search and replace through a whole bunch of files. And the advantage of that is that if I do a search and replace through a whole bunch of files, there's a pretty good chance I'll miss one. And so then not everything on my website will look the same, or it won't work properly. So this is really important from a software design point of view, that we don't have code duplication, that we're able to write a code in one place and change it in one place and have those changes reflected across the whole website. So another thing this is really useful for is adding navigation bars to your site. All you have to do is make a navbar template, and you can extend your base template and also extend your navbar template, and now you've got the same navbar in every page of your website. If you want to change the navbar, you change it in navbar.html, and it's automatically updated on every page of your website. This is awesome. It's also great for creating lots of pages that have the same layout. So for example, maybe you want to have some sort of sidebar on every page. We're going to do, in the next lab, I hope to have you make an adventure game. And it'll be a lot like the adventure game you did in Lab 1. You'll have some description of the room you're in, the objects that are there. But you're also going to have a little sidebar that keeps track of things like your health and maybe an inventory of things that you've discovered. And maybe we'll have another sidebar for a map. I don't know yet. But at any rate, those variables will be globally defined. And as you fight monsters and things in your game, your health will change. But that sidebar will be the same on every room that you visit. So you won't have to write the code for that multiple times. You'll just use a template, and it'll be there. So this is really nice. So in summary, Jinja's a Python web templating framework. It comes prepackaged with Flask, which means that when you install Flask, you get it for free. And you can use it by calling the render template function. It makes it easy to generate many pages that have the same look and feel, or the same navigation bar. To use it, we embed variables using curly a variable name syntax. We also can use Jinja to do loops, where we can repeat the same HTML code over and over and over with slightly different content. We can embed if statements into the web page that cause it to generate some HTML if a condition's true and other HTML if it's not. And we can use template inheritance using block and end block and the extends keyword. I hope that you get some time to tinker with this. Good luck on your labs.